Picture this. You're tucked safely in your bed, maybe reading one last story before sleep, when you stumble across a tale so disturbing that you'll never look at children's books the same way again. We think we know fairy tales, those comforting stories about talking animals, magical transformations, and happily ever after. But hidden in plain sight, passed down through generations of storytellers, is one particular fairy tale that wasn't created to comfort children. It was designed to prepare them for something far more sinister than any monster under the bed. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a story that has been haunting humanity for over 800 years. A tale so psychologically devastating that it has survived in dozens of cultures, adapted into countless versions, yet always maintaining its core message. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who promise to love you. This isn't just another dark origin story about sanitized Disney classics. This is about a fairy tale that continues to play out in real life, in modern courtrooms, in missing person reports, and in the nightmares of survivors who recognize the pattern all too well. The story I'm talking about is Beauty and the Beast. But forget everything you think you know about Belle's romantic adventure. The original tale wasn't about love conquering all, it was a survival manual for recognizing psychological manipulation, Stockholm Syndrome, and the grooming techniques that predators have used for centuries to trap their victims. What makes this fairy tale truly haunting isn't just its dark origins, it's how perfectly it describes the psychology of abusive relationships that destroy lives today. You see, the Brothers Grimm weren't just collecting charming folk stories. They were documenting the behavioral patterns of human predators, wrapped in metaphor and magic, to make the unbearable truths easier to digest. Every element of Beauty and the Beast, the isolation, the gift-giving, the gradual normalization of captivity, the victim's eventual identification with their captor, these weren't fantasy elements. They were warning signs, carefully preserved and passed down because communities had learned, through terrible experience, exactly how monsters operated in human form. The earliest recorded version of Beauty and the Beast appears in the works of French novelist Gabrielle Suzanne de Villeneuve in 1740, but the story she was adapting was already ancient by then. Medieval manuscripts from across Europe contain fragments of similar tales, stories about young women taken captive by mysterious figures who gradually won their affection through a combination of kindness and complete control over their environment. But these weren't romantic fantasies. They were based on documented cases of what medieval authorities called love imprisonment. In 14th century France, court records detail the case of Marguerite de Montfort, a merchant's daughter who disappeared from her village at age 16. When she was found 2 years later, she refused to leave her captor's isolated manor house, insisting that she loved him and that he had never harmed her. The investigating magistrates discovered that her captor, a nobleman named Henri de Beaumont, had systematically isolated her from all human contact except himself, gradually convinced her that her family had abandoned her, and created a world where her survival depended entirely on his approval. What made this case particularly disturbing was Marguerite's complete psychological transformation. Witnesses who had known her before described a confident, outspoken young woman. The person they found was timid, anxious when separated from her captor, even briefly, and unable to make simple decisions without his guidance. She had been fed well, clothed in fine fabrics, and given books and musical instruments for entertainment. To outside observers, she appeared to be living in luxury. But psychological evaluation revealed something far more sinister. Her captor had systematically destroyed her sense of self and replaced it with complete dependency on him. This pattern appeared repeatedly in medieval court documents across Europe. The technique was so effective that legal scholars of the time began documenting what they called willing captivity, cases where victims would defend their captors and resist rescue attempts. These weren't isolated incidents involving uniquely vulnerable individuals. They were systematic examples of what we now recognize as psychological conditioning carried out by predators who had learned to weaponize human attachment and survival instincts. The beast in the original stories wasn't a metaphor for masculine roughness or social awkwardness. The beast was a precise description of predatory behavior, someone who used their power to completely control another person's environment, emotions, and reality. The physical transformation in the fairy tale represented something psychologists now understand all too well. Victims of prolonged psychological abuse often develop a distorted perception of their abuser, literally seeing them differently than outside observers do. Medieval communities developed the Beauty and the Beast narrative as a warning system, but also as an explanation for why victims sometimes refused rescue. Parents used these stories to teach their daughters to recognize the early warning signs of predatory attention, the excessive gift-giving, the isolation from family and friends, the gradual erosion of personal autonomy disguised as protection and care. But they also used them to help communities understand that victims who had been successfully conditioned weren't weak or complicit. They were survivors whose minds had adapted to impossible circumstances. The most chilling aspect of these historical cases is how sophisticated the psychological manipulation had become. Medieval predators weren't operating on instinct. They were using refined techniques that modern psychology recognizes as deliberate conditioning methods. They understood that physical force was less effective than psychological control, that victims who believed they were choosing to stay were less likely to attempt escape, and that creating emotional dependency was more reliable than using fear alone. Church records from this period reveal that clergy members were specifically trained to recognize signs of what they called enchantment, not supernatural magic, but psychological manipulation so complete that victims appeared to be under a spell. These training materials described behavioral patterns that mirror modern understanding of trauma bonding, learned helplessness, and complex PTSD. The medieval church, despite its many flaws, recognized that these victims needed specialized care and that simply removing them from their captors wasn't sufficient for recovery. What makes Beauty and the Beast truly haunting is how precisely it maps the psychology of predatory relationships. Every element of the traditional story corresponds to documented stages of psychological conditioning that turn victims into willing participants in their own captivity. This isn't accidental. The fairy tale survived because it accurately described patterns that communities witnessed repeatedly, relationships that looked like love from the outside but functioned as sophisticated psychological prisons. The story always begins with a crisis that creates vulnerability. Belle's father faces financial ruin, her family loses their social status, and she finds herself in a position where she must sacrifice herself to save someone she loves. This mirrors the real-world circumstances that predators actively seek out: people in transition, facing loss, or dealing with trauma that has disrupted their normal support systems. Modern research on abusive relationships confirms that predators specifically target individuals during periods of vulnerability, when normal judgment is compromised by stress or grief. The beast's initial approach follows a pattern that survivors of psychological abuse recognize immediately. He doesn't present himself as overtly threatening. Instead, he offers a solution to Belle's impossible situation. He'll spare her father's life in exchange for her company, He frames this as a business transaction, even a noble sacrifice, rather than what it actually is, kidnapping with the victim's coerced consent. This mirrors how real predators operate, presenting themselves as rescuers or offering solutions to problems they may have created themselves. Once Belle agrees to stay, the beast begins implementing what psychologists now call environmental control. She's given beautiful clothes, delicious food, and access to an enormous library, all forms of positive reinforcement that create cognitive dissonance. How can this be imprisonment when she's being treated so well? The gifts aren't expressions of love, they're tools of conditioning, designed to create confusion about the nature of her situation and make her feel guilty for viewing her captor negatively. The isolation is presented as protection. The beast tells Belle that the outside world is dangerous, that her family is better off without her, that she's safer in his castle than anywhere else. This systematic separation from external reality allows the beast to become Belle's only source of information about the world, her only social contact, and ultimately her only reference point for normal human interaction. Without outside perspectives to contradict the beast's version of reality, Belle gradually accepts his worldview as truth. The beast's carefully modulated displays of temper serve a specific psychological purpose. He never hurts Belle physically, but his anger creates an atmosphere of unpredictable threat that keeps her hypervigilant and focused on managing his emotional states. She learns to read his moods, anticipate his needs, and modify her behavior to avoid triggering his displeasure. This constant vigilance is exhausting and gradually erodes her ability to maintain her own emotional boundaries or sense of self. Perhaps most insidiously, the beast creates situations where Belle must choose to stay. He offers her opportunities to leave, then manipulates circumstances so that choosing to go would seem selfish or harmful to others. When she asks to visit her dying father, he agrees, but sets a time limit, making her departure feel temporary and conditional. This creates the illusion of choice, while ensuring that leaving becomes psychologically impossible. Belle begins to believe that staying is her decision, rather than recognizing that all her options have been carefully controlled. The transformation element of the story represents the most disturbing aspect of this psychological conditioning. Belle doesn't just learn to tolerate the beast, she begins to see him differently, to perceive his controlling behavior as evidence of his love for her. The fairy tale describes this as magic, but modern psychology recognizes it as trauma bonding, the process by which victims develop emotional attachments to their abusers as a survival mechanism. What makes this pattern particularly dangerous is that it feels authentic to the victim. Belle's growing affection for the beast isn't fake or performed. It's a genuine psychological response to prolonged isolation and conditioning. She experiences real emotions, makes what feel like real choices, and develops what seems like real love. The fact that these feelings are the result of manipulation doesn't make them less powerful or easier to overcome. The story also illustrates how victims begin to internalize their captor's worldview and defend it against outside criticism. When Belle's father and sisters express concern about her situation, she defends the beast and insists that they don't understand him. She becomes protective of the very person who has systematically destroyed her autonomy, unable to recognize that her fierce loyalty is a symptom of her conditioning rather than evidence of the beast's goodness. The transformation of Belle's fear into love isn't magical. It's a documented psychological phenomenon that has been systematically studied since the 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm that gave Stockholm Syndrome its name. But the psychological pattern itself is far older, and Beauty and the Beast provides one of the most accurate early descriptions of how victims develop emotional bonds with their captors as a survival mechanism. What makes this fairy tale particularly disturbing is how it romanticizes a psychological response that indicates severe trauma rather than true love. Stockholm Syndrome develops through specific conditions that the beast creates deliberately in Belle's life. First, there must be a perceived threat to survival. Belle believes the beast could kill her at any moment, and his displays of controlled anger reinforce this fear. Second, the captor must show small kindnesses that create cognitive dissonance. The beast provides Belle with comfort, entertainment, and even moments of apparent understanding that contradict her perception of him as purely threatening. Third, isolation from outside perspectives is crucial. Belle has no contact with anyone except the beast and his servants, who are themselves under his control. Without external validation of her original perception of the situation, Belle begins to doubt her own judgment and accept the beast's interpretation of their relationship. Finally, the victim must perceive escape as impossible. Belle believes that leaving would result in her father's death and her family's ruin, making her captivity feel like a choice rather than a circumstance imposed by force. Modern research reveals that Stockholm Syndrome is not a sign of weakness or moral failure. It's an adaptive response that helps victims survive psychological torture. When someone's survival depends entirely on another person's whims, developing emotional attachment to that person increases the chances of receiving positive treatment. Belle's growing love for the beast represents her mind's attempt to create safety in an impossible situation by aligning her emotional interests with those of her captor. The fairy tale accurately depicts how victims begin to perceive their captors as protectors rather than threats. Belle starts to see the beast as her savior from loneliness, poverty, and the dangers of the outside world, rather than recognizing him as the source of her isolation and fear. This psychological reversal is so complete that Belle eventually becomes afraid of leaving the beast, interpreting her trauma response as evidence that she cannot survive without him. What makes Beauty and the Beast particularly insidious is how it presents Stockholm Syndrome as the foundation for true love. Belle's emotional attachment to the beast is portrayed as romantic awakening rather than psychological adaptation to trauma. The story suggests that her love transforms the beast into a better person, rather than acknowledging that her conditioning has simply made her incapable of accurately perceiving the nature of their relationship. Real cases of Stockholm Syndrome often follow this exact pattern. Victims describe feeling grateful to their captors for small mercies, developing concern for their captors' well-being, and eventually identifying so completely with their captor's perspective that they defend the relationship against outside interference. Elizabeth Smart, who was kidnapped at age 14 and held captive for 9 months, described how she gradually stopped trying to escape, not because she loved her captors, but because her mind adapted to captivity as a way of psychological survival. The most disturbing aspect of the Stockholm Syndrome interpretation is how it explains the beast's transformation in the story. He doesn't actually change his behavior. Belle's perception of that behavior changes as her psychological conditioning progresses. Actions that initially seemed threatening and controlling are reinterpreted as protective and loving. The beast's jealousy becomes evidence of his devotion, his isolation of Belle becomes evidence of his desire to keep her safe, and his emotional manipulation becomes evidence of his vulnerability and need for her care. This psychological reframing is precisely what happens in real abusive relationships. Victims learn to interpret controlling behavior as love, to to see isolation as special attention, and to view their captor's emotional volatility as evidence of passionate feeling rather than manipulative control. The fairy tale provides a template for this reinterpretation, teaching readers that what initially appears to be imprisonment can actually be the deepest form of love. The ending of Beauty and the Beast is particularly problematic from a psychological perspective because it suggests that Belle's love successfully rehabilitates the beast. This reinforces the dangerous myth that victims can heal their abusers through sufficient devotion and understanding. In reality, Stockholm Syndrome relationships rarely result in genuine change from the captor. Instead, they create permanent psychological damage in the victim that can take years of specialized therapy to address. The fairy tale's romantic resolution obscures the fact that Belle has been fundamentally altered by her experience. Her personality, decision-making abilities, and capacity for independent thought have been systematically dismantled and rebuilt around the beast's needs and preferences. What the story presents as a happy ending is actually the successful completion of a psychological conditioning program that has destroyed Belle's autonomous self and replaced it with a version designed to serve her captor's emotional needs. The most chilling aspect of Beauty and the Beast isn't its historical origins, it's how perfectly it describes predatory relationships that destroy lives today. The psychological techniques documented in medieval manuscripts haven't disappeared. They've evolved and refined, appearing in modern contexts that make them even more difficult to recognize and escape. From domestic abuse to human trafficking to online predation, the beast's methods continue to operate with devastating effectiveness in the 21st century. Modern domestic abusers follow the Beauty and the Beast template with frightening precision. They target individuals during vulnerable periods, after job loss, family death, relationship ending, or other major life transitions when normal judgment is compromised. Like the beast, they present themselves as rescuers, offering solutions to immediate problems while gradually creating new dependencies that make escape impossible. The gifts and grand gestures that characterize the early stages of abusive relationships serve the same psychological function as the beast's luxurious provisions. They create cognitive dissonance that makes victims question their perception of the relationship's true nature. The isolation tactics used by modern predators mirror those depicted in the fairy tale with remarkable accuracy. Abusers systematically separate victims from family and friends, not through physical force, but through emotional manipulation that makes the victim choose isolation. They create conflicts between the victim and their support network, present themselves as the only person who truly understands the victim, and gradually convince the victim that outside relationships are sources of stress rather than support. Technology has made these isolation tactics even more sophisticated. Digital surveillance allows abusers to monitor their victims' communications, location, and online activity with unprecedented precision. Social media creates new opportunities for controlling the victim's public image and relationships. Dating apps and online platforms provide predators with detailed information about potential victims' vulnerabilities and circumstances before first contact, allowing them to craft their initial approach with surgical precision. The financial control depicted in Beauty and the Beast, where Belle's family's economic crisis creates the initial vulnerability and the beast's wealth maintains her captivity, remains a central element of modern abusive relationships. Economic abuse, where victims are prevented from working, have their finances controlled, or are made financially dependent on their abuser, affects 94% of domestic violence survivors, according to recent studies. Like Belle, Many victims stay in dangerous situations because leaving would mean financial devastation, not just for themselves, but for family members who depend on them. Human trafficking operations use the Beauty and the Beast template so consistently that it appears in anti-trafficking training materials as a warning model. Traffickers identify vulnerable individuals, often young people aging out of foster care, immigrants without legal status, or people struggling with addiction or mental health issues, and offer solutions to their immediate problems. They provide housing, food, clothes, and emotional support while gradually isolating victims from outside contacts and creating dependencies that make escape seem impossible. The grooming process used by online predators follows Belle's psychological journey with disturbing precision. Predators identify potential victims through social media posts that indicate vulnerability, loneliness, or family conflict. They present themselves as understanding friends who offer emotional support and validation. Gradually, they isolate victims from real-world relationships by convincing them that online friends understand them better than family or local peers. The relationship becomes increasingly intimate and controlling until the victim's emotional reality centers entirely around the predator's attention and approval. What makes modern versions of this pattern particularly dangerous is how cultural narratives about romance continue to romanticize controlling behavior. Popular media portrays jealousy as passion, isolation as intimacy, and emotional volatility as depth of feeling. Young people are taught to interpret possessiveness as love and to see dramatic gestures as evidence of commitment rather than warning signs of psychological manipulation. The Me Too movement revealed how the Beauty and the Beast dynamic operates in professional settings, where power imbalances create circumstances similar to Belle's captivity. Victims describe how workplace predators used career advancement, financial security, and professional reputation as tools of control, creating situations where resistance could result in professional destruction. Like Belle, many victims felt they were choosing to maintain relationships that were actually sustained through sophisticated coercion. Perhaps most disturbing is how victims of modern predatory relationships often defend their abusers, using language that mirrors Belle's defense of the Beast. They insist that outsiders don't understand the relationship, that their partner's controlling behavior is evidence of love, and that they are choosing to stay rather than being prevented from leaving. This isn't evidence of the relationship's legitimacy. It's evidence of successful psychological conditioning that has replicated the Stockholm Syndrome dynamics documented in the original Fairytale. The Fairytale's ending, where Belle's love supposedly transforms the Beast into a prince, continues to influence how society responds to abusive relationships. Victims are encouraged to be more understanding, to try harder to help their abusers change, and to believe that sufficient love and patience can rehabilitate even the most controlling partners. This narrative places responsibility for the abuser's behavior on the victim while ignoring the reality that predatory behavior typically escalates rather than improves over time. Modern psychology recognizes that the personality changes Belle undergoes the loss of independence, the hypervigilance about her captor's moods, the inability to make decisions without considering his preferences, are symptoms of complex trauma that require specialized treatment. Recovery from this type of psychological conditioning is possible, but it typically requires extensive therapy, strong support systems, and often years of work to rebuild the autonomous self that was systematically dismantled during the abusive relationship. The Beauty and the Beast fairy tale continues to haunt us, not because it's an ancient curiosity, but because it provides a perfect blueprint for psychological predation that remains devastatingly effective today. Understanding this pattern isn't just academically interesting, it's literally a matter of life and death for the millions of people currently trapped in relationships that follow the beast's carefully documented methods of beautiful destruction.